announce what you're doing before you do it. I don't know why that is. So hopefully you all had, sorry, a nice Thanksgiving. Choking is not really funny, but I was laughing. Hopefully you had a good Thanksgiving. Maybe you have leftover turkey still, so you can have a sandwich or something today. That'd be nice. And hopefully everything's back to normal as far as work and school and all that kind of thing, and that you're doing well. We are on the 4th unit. Woohoo! So we're almost toward the end. Some questions that I've had, so I'll just answer these in case you have these questions. The final exam, there's no actual final exam. You just have a unit test over the last 3 chapters. So it's not cumulative, it's just the test over the last 3 chapters. And it's really the quiz, you know, it's one of those 20 question kind of things. And it will show up next Wednesday, not this Wednesday, but next Wednesday. Because we're wrapping stuff up, you turning stuff in late is not as cool as it was earlier, although it's not my favorite thing. Certainly it was allowed in the syllabus. Now, if you've already used up your I'm going to turn in 2 things late thing, don't turn in any more stuff late, okay? Okay, you're done. That's enough. But I'm looking, sorry, calendar. I should have had that pulled up. I could put the syllabus up, but our class last day is December 10th, which is a Thursday. Your work will be due on that Friday, the 11th, and my grades will be due on the 15th. So I'm really going to need you to turn in stuff that weekend, maybe the 14th if there's an emergency, but after the 14th, I am just not interested in your stuff because my grades need to be done by 5 o'clock on the 15th. So I don't want you turning stuff in at 4 o'clock on the 15th. That would be problematic for me. And your grade probably wouldn't be what you want it to be. Also, this is the point at which if you have questions about your grade, I don't mean like during class right now, this moment, but this point of the class where you probably want to ask stuff. If there's something that you've turned in that I haven't graded, and like you have turned it in more than a week ago, now's a good time to remind me like, hey, what about this? Just in case, remembering that I have like 100 students and you guys have 4 or 5 things per unit to turn in. So I could make a mistake. It's not my goal, never want to, but if I do, you know, it's not a mistake that I want to continue. So let me know if you're concerned that I haven't graded something. You know, send me an email or we can have a meeting or something like that. And if I've seemed like I don't want to talk to you about that kind of stuff, I do. I'm sorry if I was cranky, but yeah, let me know because we want to make sure your grade's right. Because you know this is in high school. It's not real easy to fix once the 15th passes. So I need to know stuff pretty soon if you're concerned. People also keep asking, how do I figure my grade? It's like, I don't know. I don't know what else to tell you. So I'm going to try again. Unfortunately for you, I'm probably going to tell you the same thing I've already told you, which hasn't been effective to this point, but I'm still going to try one more time. And if it doesn't work still, send me an email and I'll try to explain it. And then, well, sorry. So in theory, you have 300 points available in this class. Also, I'm just going to remind you, my grades don't go directly from Blackboard to ACC. I have a form that I fill in where I give you an A, B, C, D, or F. So they don't go directly from Blackboard to ACC. Okay, so that's a separate step for me, so I fill those in separate. So you have 300 points total. I know that there are actually more than 300 points available. There's really 330, but officially 330 points. So if you want an A, you need a book review plus 270 points. A B is 240 points, and a C is 210. You probably don't want any other option. So whatever you have right now, I mean, I should have graded, if you turn in your stuff on time or close to on time, all of your weekly stuff should be graded. So subtract what your current point total is from what it is you would like to have. So let's say you have 180 points right now, and you're hoping that you end up the semester with 210, because that would be a C. So again, I didn't study a lot of math on purpose, so 210 minus 80 seems like 30 to me. So of the remaining 70 points, you would need 30 of those to get a C, which means you're probably in good shape. So just subtract what you have from what you want and see how that goes. And that'll tell you how many points you need on the remaining 70. You have 3 weekly questions and then a 40-point quiz. That's what you have left, okay? And if you turn in the book review yesterday, I clearly haven't graded it. So if you turned it in earlier than yesterday, I might have graded it. So if you turned it in yesterday, I'm going to work on grading tomorrow and Friday. So, and it's my goal to get all of those done this week, because next week and the week after are going to be incredibly hectic for me and for you as well. So we want to make sure all of that stuff is done. All right, so grades, see what else. Don't turn in stuff late if you can help it. If you can turn in your questions earlier, that would be better than late, and even better than on time. But that weekend that I'm grading your stuff, also I'll have UT grades due, so you know, it's the way. Of course, it's the same for you, because all of your classes, all your stuff's due at the same time, so I know you understand. All right. Anything else we need to talk about besides history? Is there anything to talk about besides history? It's the most important thing in the world. Let's look at the weekly questions. Yeah, let's look at this. Okay, you may or may not have noticed I did a separate video about the Reagan question. You should be able to access that. I sent the link to you, and I think it just says fall 2020 Reagan question. It doesn't say your class, like noon class or anything like that, because I just didn't want them, because you know, I would have said the same thing to all 3 of my classes. So there it is. On the Reagan question, I've graded a few of those. My concern about the answers typically is you're not telling me specific stuff he did. Like you say, like he increased defense spending and improved the economy. Okay, give me some data that proves that. So tell me what the spending levels were or what the programs were, give me some dates, that sort of thing. So, you know, because it's a history class, still always when stuff happens matters. Also, one of the things that I noticed is grading your stuff, grading any stuff, is if you don't put the date next to the event, like just put it in parentheses, it's going to make it less or more likely that you're going to talk about things out of order. And in a history class, we really want you to talk about things in the order they happened, because they typically show a change over time, or they help reveal cause and effect. They're not unrelated, you know. If I don't know if the fellow named Zimmerman sends a telegram to Mexico about engaging in conflict with the United States, it might have something to do with the United States joining the war a few months after. So, you know, if you put those things in chronological order, it shows cause and effect. I know that's not the best example, but it is an example that works. So don't give me a hard time unless you want to. All right. So if you've done the Reagan question and you didn't get all the points you wanted, because you turned it in early, you know, I've already told you, you can go back and redo that if you like. So feel free to do that. Question number 2, I've also had people answer, I've had people answer all 3 of these questions already. I admire your determination to get stuff done early. So those like 5 of you that have done that. The Bush question, same thing. Make sure you give me some examples. And the Bush examples don't have to be from the Bush administration, because he's saying this stuff in his inaugural, they can be, but they don't have to be, because he's saying this in his inaugural address in 2001 before he served as president. So he's not talking about stuff that he has done in his presidency. He's talking about things that the United States has done. to protect, not possess, defend, not conquer. And I know some of you have already complained pretty bitterly about imperialism within the United States, which I get. I mean, we can't deny these things. But I wouldn't ignore times that maybe the United States has done things that really aren't in their self-interest. If you see a couple of those, you're likely to see a few of those in the Clinton administration, which I think is why this question is okay for chapter 27, because I know that chapter 27 doesn't talk a lot about Bush, but it does talk about the two administrations previous to Bush, where we send the troops a lot of places. So some of those places, you know, it does look like self-interest, where maybe we're protecting an oil supply or an ally. In other instances, we're protecting people that don't even like us. And I mean, you can still say that we're doing it for ulterior motives. I'm not going to necessarily disagree with you, but on questions like number 2, when you agree or disagree with a statement, don't necessarily ignore the side that you disagree with. You know, at least acknowledge it, because, you know, if you pretend there's no argument on the other side, you're not quite doing your job as a history student. So at least acknowledge it and say, like, even though we went to Rwanda, which clearly wasn't in our best interest and didn't end well for us or the people in, or Somalia, wherever we went, sorry. We do send troops a lot of places, as some of you can personally attest to. Make sure that you acknowledge both sides of the question. And then question number 3, I've had a couple people turn this in. And please notice, and I haven't graded these yet, but I'll grade them this week for this reason. The people who've turned in the ones about Trump and Obama are comparing what they've accomplished, which isn't exactly what the question's asking. It's asking to compare their presidential campaigns. Now, if you're going to compare what they've accomplished, you should at least mention that they promised to do those things, because that will at least relate it to their campaign. I would probably talk about their use of technology, social media, how they raised money, if they raised money, they both do, of course, and who votes for them and why. One of the weird things that Obama and Trump have in common is that little group of swing voters who voted for both Obama and Trump because they're so similar, or because they both promised to change things in a dramatic way. With Obama, it was hope and change, and with Trump, he's draining the swamp. And there's an unusual, I almost used the wrong word there, unusual cross-section of voters who voted for both Obama and Trump, and they probably controlled both elections. I think it's fascinatingly odd. I am not a member of that cross-section, although, no, I'm definitely not. I know people who are, and it puzzles me, I'm not gonna lie to you, but it's an interesting phenomenon. Maybe some of you are that way, but now is not a time to reveal it. Sorry. Other thing, oh yeah, notes. Let's talk about the stuff from today. Do you guys have any questions? Is there anything you want to ask right now? It's like, no, just talk about the stuff. Just talk about the stuff. Okay. Talking about the stuff. All right, when we last left history, it was before Thanksgiving. You had not had turkey or pumpkin pie or whatever you eat for Thanksgiving. And you had not gone shopping. Did you go shopping? I did that online. And we had not talked about anybody beyond, say, Ronald Reagan. So, oh, and on the Reagan question, the ones I've graded, some of them haven't commented about why he was popular, even though maybe he shouldn't have been. That's not exactly what the question says, but he left with a lot of debt and with a little scandal right at the end. So it may seem odd that he was as popular as he was when he left, but he was very popular. So maybe don't forget to discuss why he was still popular at the end. And there are legitimate reasons for that. And some of them are style and some are substance. So, all right, next chapter is 27, and it goes through 89 to 2001. So right up to the point where Bush is elected and takes office, I think it gets you through a brief discussion of 9/11. So, all right, we'll talk a little bit about Bush and Clinton today, and then we'll wrap up Clinton and discuss the weekly question next time in a little more depth. All right, so after Reagan, we elected George H.W. Bush, and he ran against, who did he run against? That short fellow from Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, who his family was fairly prominent in the area. He'd been governor of Massachusetts, and his mom was a fairly famous actress. And people kind of liked him, but he didn't campaign well. Not that Bush was great at campaigning, but Bush, people knew who he was. He'd been vice president for 8 years. He'd been the CIA director before that, although that's not as prominent a position. I mean, people in Washington certainly knew who he was. He had been an ambassador to China, and he had been a senator. He had a degree from Yale, a law degree from, I think it was a law degree from Yale. But honestly, as far as resumes go, you're not going to find somebody with a better I know how to run government kind of resume than a fellow like George H.W. Bush, which doesn't necessarily mean we're going to elect you. It just means that, you know, you have a lot of the traditional background that you need. And certainly the guy that ran against him was qualified. I'm not suggesting, but Bush is overwhelmingly qualified. So we vote for him. And he had been Reagan's vice president. Reagan was popular, so why the heck not? And, you know, it might be part of what helped Joe Biden, possibly. I don't know. There's some other things probably that helped as well. Some of you are going like, yeah, voter fraud. Like, okay, we've got a couple more weeks. Hopefully about the time this class is over, maybe the presidential election will be over too. I know some of you are like, it's over. I know, but there's still a couple more court challenges. If you're wondering, like, I have a friend that's just really upset about the election. Like, what do we know? How come we don't ever know? It's like, honestly, we never know until the middle of December, until the electors vote. And certainly when the Bush-Gore election, that we'll talk about more next time, happened, it was longer than this and probably more controversial, although certainly, you know, on a smaller scale, because we knew the issue was Florida. It wasn't, you know, 5 or 6 different states that were being challenged. It was one. But, you know, we never officially know until each state certifies their vote, and then the electors vote in the middle of December. It's just, we always honestly really know, we just don't officially know. So, all right, so Bush, we knew he got elected. It wasn't close. There was no controversy. Not as, you know, probably not too many dead people voted. I don't know. But he gets elected, and things are, you know, we liked Reagan. The economy's on the uptick. Things are getting better. We're starting to have more online business. The internet's starting to be a thing. So, you know, we're in good shape here. So we just want to kind of maintain. We want the same thing to go on. And then somebody goes rogue in Iraq and Kuwait, this Saddam Hussein fellow. I don't know if you know much about him, but he's the dictator and he's bad. I know you would think those two go together, but he, you know, killed you if you disagreed with him. He had a wood chipper that he put people through. He's apparently just about as brutal a guy as, you know, there is in that region. And his country decided that the oil, I know there's a lot of oil in Iraq, but the oil-rich country of Kuwait was actually the 13th province of Iraq. So they invaded it and said, like, hey, now you're part of us. And then the Kuwaitis at the United Nations said, hey, United Nations, we're not a part of them. So you need to come and get Iraq the heck out of our country. So the UN put together a coalition led by the United States, because that's what we do, to escort the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And it was not a gentle escort. It involved a few months of strategic bombing. which we essentially televised. And one of the things that you'll notice with this war, if you study it in much detail or if you participated in it, because there's probably some of you of the right age that participated in this, maybe. We wanted to make sure that the press on this war was better than, say, the press in Vietnam. So the government is going to, we'll say, coordinate with the press. They're going to embed journalists with certain units. They're going to send them on certain missions, and they're going to pick and choose, where they want them to go. And typically they do a pretty good job of picking and choosing missions they know are going to go well. So they want to show our troops having success. They also want to show the success in a slightly sanitized kind of way, to where, we'll drop a bomb and the bomb is effective, but you don't actually see who or what it hits. So you see it from the perspective of the person dropping the bomb. And to be honest with you, the way it was televised, it really looked like a game, like a video game. And the goal was not to show the human destruction that was caused by the war, because nobody's in favor of that, whether you win the war or lose the war. And this is also an era where the people who were conducting the war talked about how if we had covered World War II the way we covered Vietnam, people would have been opposed to that as well, because, and some of you wrote about this, especially if you wrote book reviews about books around World War II, or in that World War II question where you talked about whether World War II was a good war or not. To see the human cost of any war is pretty horrific stuff. So this war was very popular. It doesn't last very long. It's 3 or 4 months long. It's kind of our modern version of the Spanish-American War. We're incredibly successful. We don't get an empire from it, although some people would argue. I mean, you'll get that chance with the Bush question. What we do is push Saddam Hussein back into Iraq, as we're supposed to do, because the UN said we. And almost every nation in the world agreed with that mission, and almost every nation in the world participated in either a small or larger way. So when Saddam Hussein and his troops, of course, are pushed back into Iraq, it's seen as a fairly overwhelming victory. Now, most of the world against Iraq is going to be fairly successful, and the U.S. military is fairly impressive at this point. It still is. I'm not suggesting that it's not. And it's not so much the size, but the technology. Certainly our military is going to be bigger than the Iraqi military, but the technology that we have is really unmatched. And people would probably rightfully argue that it still is. So the ground troops, especially, once we send in ground troops to Kuwait, the Iraqi ground troops primarily will just surrender. They surrender. There's a really famous incident where they surrender to a CNN crew. It's like, just get us out. We don't want to get shot, because they've been bombed for 3 months already. It's like, no, we're done with this. No, it's not going to work out. Now, they don't overthrow Saddam Hussein, because that's not what the UN had suggested they should do. People will argue later that might be what we should have done at this point, and that will leave a small controversy. But generally, this war is very popular, and Bush is very popular because of this war. They always do those surveys. Do you like the president? Do you not like the president? The presidential approval survey. And Bush's general approval was at 90% right after the Gulf War. And that's of Democrats and Republicans. So it looks like he's going to easily sail to re-election. Sail? Well, he probably did have a vote. But that's not exactly how it happened. Did I mention to you that Bush was also a World War II veteran? Did I mention that? I'm telling you, Bush was the ideal presidential candidate, old school. Nowadays, I don't know. I don't know who the ideal, because, once you elect Trump, and Obama as well, although Obama, did have some legislative experience, it was smaller. Trump was the non-political candidate. So I don't know if we'll have another one like that in, soon. And certainly Biden is kind of a swing back to tradition in some ways, the guy who's already been there. But anyway, Bush, very popular after the Gulf War. All right. And then not so popular. Okay. Now, the other important stuff, crud, I didn't mention this to the last class. Why didn't you guys have me do this last class when you weren't there? The Soviet Union does collapse beginning of the Bush administration. So he kind of is, I don't want to say he's given credit for that, but he oversees a lot of the negotiations between the United States and the former Soviet Union. So the Cold War ends. We're successful in Iraq, or Kuwait, really. And you would think Bush will win re-election, but the problem, two problems. One, the economy has a little bit of a recession. It's often referred to as the Bush recession. And because of who it affects, it probably matters more to voters than it normally would. Because we have recessions, they're a fairly regular part of a business cycle. You've lived through a couple of them. Recessions are not uncommon, but this recession disproportionately affected middle class and upper middle class people because of the parts of the economy that collapsed. The savings and loan industry, banking, a type of bank, a looser type of bank that gives out loans for houses and businesses, and the dot-com collapse, the online economy. Now, this is early in the days of the internet. So these are the entrepreneurs who have started companies, who grow, the companies grow really fast. They probably don't manage the growth terribly fast and or terribly well. And then there's a correction. And savings and loan, outside of student loans, which some of you are probably too familiar with, which they'll give to anybody, which is great and terrible, as you know. It's really hard to get other types of loans from banks and savings and loans during this time period. So to get a loan, you kind of had to have collateral. So you had to own something. You had to have something that the bank could take away from you if you didn't pay them back. So the dot-com is for collapses for entrepreneurs, people who start businesses. And the savings and loan collapse also probably for people who bought houses or did investments or started businesses. So this disproportionately affects upper income people, and those people always vote. So they are going to be frustrated with Bush. They don't care about the foreign policy triumphs, which are quite impressive. They care that they just lost a huge portion of their net wealth. So they are going to push back against Bush. He also promised that even though we had a deficit, that we would cut back on spending and try to raise revenue, but we would not raise taxes. No new taxes, read my lips. And then he raised a few taxes because, the debt was getting bigger. And he was not forgiven, by people who voted for him the first time. So it wasn't necessarily that there's a groundswell of support for Bill Clinton, although, he did pretty well. But it's a problem within people who had previously supported Bush. Sorry. Excuse me. So, Bush runs for re-election in '92. And we've had all these great foreign policy things. Also, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is widely heralded as one of the most important pieces of domestic legislation in some time. So this enables people who need better access to use public facilities, businesses, that sort of stuff, and also enables people with learning disabilities to get accommodations in their schools and colleges. So and at work, almost everybody thinks this is a great idea. So Bush is very popular for a lot of things, but then the economy, and we tend not to re-elect a president when the economy is bad, and that's what happened. and especially because this disproportionately affected wealthier people, not rich people, but people that made pretty good salaries. All right, so when he runs in 92, he says, you know me, I'll do the same thing. We'll try to get the economy rolling again. We'll, you know, try to cut back on spending. So it's like Bush 2. We know what Bush 1 was like. And plus, I'm great at foreign policy, which no one could deny. Or we could have Bill Clinton, who nobody knew, but he was kind of a fun guy and seemed really smart. And he was young and energetic, so he might be kind of our era's Kennedy. Not exactly, but maybe. And he had, like, he didn't have like the super cute, she's attractive. I'm not saying she's not attractive, but you remember people kind of fawned over Jackie, maybe you don't, but people thought Jackie Kennedy was kind of model worthy, pretty. And what we had with Mrs. Clinton was a very accomplished lawyer. So, and that probably fit the time period better anyway. So it's like, oh, and I am not, don't get upset with me. I'm not saying Mrs. Kennedy was unintelligent. She spoke several different languages. I know, she's a smart one. However, that isn't usually what people talked about when they talked about her. It's like, she's pretty. When people talked about Mrs. Clinton, they didn't always talk about how pretty she was, although she was pleasant looking, I'm not saying. All right, why am I going to all that trouble to say that? Okay, but Bush, we know what we're getting. Clinton's kind of a wild card. It might be fun. And then there's the wildest card of all during that. Oh, we are going to talk a lot about the crime bill because it's crap is why people hate it. Did I ever say stuff like that? No, somebody's asking about the crime bill that was passed during the Clinton administration. We're definitely getting to that because I think that is probably, I know Clinton would probably say, his worst legacy is his impeachment. That's a weird legacy, to be sure. Although I think in the modern era, people just look at that and go like, that was dumb. But the crime bill, that thing's rough. I mean, there's just no way around it. And the previous two administrations build up to that, but dang, what the Clinton administration and the Congress during that time period, to be fair, but they worked together on it. He didn't oppose it. Okay, back to the election, and then I'm getting to the crime bill. Oh, I want to talk about that. The crime bill is something else. All right. So the election, you've got Bush, you've got Clinton, who seems fun. Clinton's running mate is Al Gore, who does not seem fun. But they're both from the middle of the country. Clinton, Arkansas, Gore, Tennessee. Trying to appeal to like the South in the middle of the country because recently Republicans had started voting for or Southerners that started voting for Republicans. And what you had with Gore is a guy who's a little more serious-minded, climate-minded, as we know. You know, he's concerned about climate change. But also what you may or may not know is his wife was really serious about censoring movies and music. Because this is the era that, I know, like you're going like, they didn't even have music back then. Yes, we did. Although this is the era where I'm probably not paying any attention to popular music at all, because this is where and not because of the music, but because one, I'm not cool, and two, I had just started working adult jobs. I've not inappropriate adult jobs as a teacher. I'm not trying to say weird stuff, but so I wasn't paying very much attention. I was working a lot, but this I think is the beginning of the hip hop era. And my brother was in high school during the time period. It was kind of the end of the boys to men, boy band kind of thing, and into the hip hop thing. And people were starting to use bad language in music. Can you imagine? So Al Gore's wife, Tipper, was really into censoring that sort of music. And if you're wondering, like, did people like that? Yeah, the moral majority people is like, yeah, we can get into this censoring stuff. We love this. So Gore, I think, pulled along some more conservative Democrats and Southerners. That's what I'm trying to say. It took a long time. All right, the third party guy is a fellow named Ross Perot. You may or may not be familiar with him. He's unusual. We'll just go with that. He's a billionaire who managed a data company. in Texas. He's from the Dallas area, and his son inherited the company and some money and built a giant airport north of Fort Worth. Alliance Airport, I think it is. It's where all the like UPS and a lot of large businesses run their cargo shipping out of. But it's a multi-billion-dollar industry now. So they're good at making money, the Perot family. So the thought was, we need a guy good at making money. Sorry, I really need a drink of something. Coke Zero for the record. We need a guy really good at making money to fix the economy. So the thought is, why not? Let's elect a billionaire. So Ross Perot ran, and he talked a lot about the economy and always had graphs and charts, and then occasionally talked about how George Bush sent the CIA to disrupt his daughter's wedding, which was kind of an interesting day when he said that, which made people think that maybe Perot wasn't, what's the right word? I don't want to say normal, because who is normal, but that he saw the world in an unusual way. Now, I'm going to suggest something to you that's just my personal opinion. I think billionaires are probably really good at making money, hence, they're billionaires, right? However, they're unusual. I mean, they're unusual because there aren't that many of them, and they must see the world in an unusual way to figure out how to make that much money. So I wouldn't expect them, I would expect an occasional billionaire to think everyone's out to get him, or that the CIA is disrupting his daughter's wedding, or, and maybe people are out to get them, although I don't know that the CIA is. Who knows? I'm not in charge of this stuff. But Ross Perot was appealing as a fellow who could make money and maybe manage the economy, and seemed a little unstable at times as a candidate. But the people who were already mad at Bush for raising taxes, and because they just lost a bunch of money, they were kind of they were millionaires, and then they might not have been millionaires after the economic collapse, but they were going to be again, was their thought. Perot appealed to them, and he also is going to be the only one of these three, Clinton, Bush, and Perot, who opposes NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Both Bush and Clinton thought that was fine, and that gets rid of the tariffs between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and it's going to change some of the transportation rules as well. So it's sort of like the EU North American version. So that was the plan, was to make trade easier between those three countries, and it works, and it doesn't. And Perot said, once we do that, he said, the giant sucking sound you're going to hear is all of our jobs going to Mexico, which may or may not have been true. Manufacturing jobs was his thought. And we did lose a lot of manufacturing jobs in the 90s and early 2000s. I'm not going to suggest to you that they all went to Mexico. I think some of them probably did. And certainly some of them, eventually come back to the United States. But Mexico probably isn't where most manufacturing jobs went. Although, again, some do. I understand. All right, back to the election. So Bush loses votes from Republicans. Perot takes votes from Republicans probably. And Bill Clinton ends up winning the presidency. He doesn't get a majority of the popular vote. He does get the most popular votes. He gets a plurality, which is more than anyone else, but not over 50%. But in our system, you don't need over 50% of the popular vote, as you know, because we've had several presidents recently elected. I'm not talking about Biden, and I'm not talking about Trump. I am talking about Trump round one. Round two, round two, he didn't get a majority either, but he also does not appear, for those of you still holding out hope for Trump, does not appear that he will be reelected. Plurality of the votes is not required, majority of electoral votes. You got to win the right states. And Clinton gets the most votes and wins the right states, so he becomes president, and then Bush goes away. and does whatever Bush does, charity work and hanging out with his family and, you know, whatever. Go Bush. Um, so Clinton becomes president, and he had promised that he would be a little more socially liberal, but fiscally conservative. So, you know, that means that the social policy is stuff like, you know, human rights, gay marriage, that kind of thing. And then fiscal policy is what you do with money. So he's saying, you know, his theme during the during the campaign was it's the economy's stupid. So his focus, is going to be on fixing the economy. And he appeals to younger voters. He campaigns by going on to evening talk shows, which were terribly popular back in that era. You know, it'd be stuff like the Jimmys, like Jimmy Kimmel and the other Jimmy Fallon, and then the British guy whose name I don't remember. But during this era, it was Arsenio Hall was kind of the cool one, and then there were the old people ones with Johnny Carson and someone else I don't remember. I watched Arsenio Hall because I was young, and that's what we did. So Clinton went on those talk shows. I think he went on MTV. I know that he did. So his goal was really to appeal to younger voters, and he was successful. He also, when he went on Arsenio Hall, he played his saxophone, and they asked him questions you didn't normally ask a presidential candidate. The weird one I remember was about his underwear, if he preferred boxers or briefs, and he answered those questions, and people thought he's young and cool. And he did have some issues with scandal, but because we really didn't know who he was, scandals in Arkansas really didn't translate nationally, so people don't really hear about him. And he focused on the economy, and he's an incredibly smart guy. And he also has a great, compelling personal story. You know, he had been very poor and risen from actual poverty, not, you know, pretend poverty where you ate some ramen while you were in college. No offense if you're eating ramen right now and you're actually poor. I know that stuff's not good for you. Yeah, but, you know, you only got 25 cents. That's what you got to eat. I get it. I used to be poor. I get it. But, you know, Clinton was like trailer park poor from Arkansas. So single mom poor. And to see somebody like that rise up it was lovely. It's just a lovely story. Gore, not so much. He had traditional, well-off family with the dad who'd been a senator and that sort of thing. So, you know, Gore is from a political family, you know, sort of like the Taft family or the Bush family. Taft, yeah, involved more in state politics, but okay. All right. You might think that because Clinton and Bush are fairly similar in their policies, this means everybody's going to get along and a lot of stuff will get done and there'll be a decrease in partisanship, but you would be wrong. You would be wrong. This seems to be the era where the partisanship really gears up, and the political parties, which had occasionally worked together in the Reagan administration, even though there were some scandals, and the Bush administration worked together more, even though, yeah, there really weren't scandals in the Bush administration. I mean, there kind of were, but there weren't really, not the way, yeah. But the Clinton administration, you're going to see the rise of some very conservative Republicans who are going to work fairly hard to cause some difficulties for Clinton. Now, one of the things you will notice is that Clinton's policies are fairly conservative in some ways, and that the Republicans and Democrats will probably work together to pass certain bills, none of which you will probably like, although some of you are like, no, that seems like an okay idea. But then, I don't know, the end results of some of those policies, which means we're getting to welfare reform and the bills about drug laws and things like that. So the prison reform, that sort of stuff. Certainly the parties work together on those, but it's also the rise of those television news stations, you know, those networks where all they talk about is news. So, they're going to be either more conservative or more liberal, and they're going to play to their base. And to get more viewers, you need to be more extreme. And then the House is always a little more extreme, House being House of Representatives. And those guys get elected every 2 years, the entire group. So they always have to be causing trouble so they can make names for themselves or doing dramatic things. Should I say causing trouble? No, I apologize. But they want to make the news so that they can get reelected. They've got to make a name for themselves quickly. So you've got a whole lot of stuff going on here. Plus, we're trying to get out of a recession. Okay, I'm exhausted just thinking about it. All right, so Clinton gets elected and some stuff happens. Okay, let's talk about, I didn't even put it in the notes, but I was definitely going to talk about the crime laws. Yeah, oh my goodness, the crime laws. We're going to talk about that and welfare reform. And NAFTA, we already mentioned NAFTA. So, crime laws, let's talk about let's talk about universal health care first, because that's really the first big push. President Clinton mostly focused on the economy, but he said, we have to make sure everybody has access to health care. So let's create a universal health care system. And since he promised that and he got elected, he figured, let's carry through on that, because that's why I got elected, because I promised universal health care. Or maybe not. So his administration devises a healthcare system, and that task force is headed up by his wife, Hillary Clinton. And people, for whatever reason, don't think that that's appropriate. She's not as personable, fairly or unfairly. She's not as good a politician as he was. So I think she kind of rubs people the wrong way, and that's not necessarily a new thing. People would say that back in these days. And then some people thought it doesn't make sense for the First Lady to head up a policy program, overlooking her background in law and some other policy background. So, she certainly was an educated, qualified person, but she was also the First Lady, and typically the First Lady was just say no, or be best, or let's get the kids to read in school, or let's get the kids eating healthier, that sort of stuff. So people thought this wasn't the appropriate place for the First Lady to be. And the Republicans had a really good PR campaign against universal health care. They had these ads. I can't remember the names of the people, but the guy's name was Harry, I think, and then the wife, I can't remember. But all these ads were this guy and his wife sitting at their kitchen table talking about whether they thought universal health care was a good idea or not. And they talked about how they were concerned about the universal health care card, which everyone would have. Therefore, the government would have access to all of your medical information. And if the computers got taken over or hacked, then people you don't want to know about you would know a lot of stuff about you. Your employer could find out stuff that maybe you didn't want them to know. Is your data safe? Also, is this the best way to go about healthcare? Is this socialized medicine? And we might get greater access to general care, but specific care isn't going to be as good, and we're going to be, again, socialist. So that may decrease the quality of healthcare, and there won't be competition. So people were nervous about it. And those commercials really highlighted the concerns that people had, and the Clinton administration really didn't counter those very well. So that bill is not successful. The welfare reform and the crime reform bills. Let's talk about the crime reform bill, since one of you asked about this. Oh my goodness. Okay, so here's what we had seen in criminal reform during this era. In the Reagan administration, and the book mentions this, there starts to be more of an emphasis on the war on drugs. You really saw that start with the Nixon administration, but it really kind of ramped up as time went along. And that was Nancy Reagan's pet project, was just say no to drugs, and we had the DARE program and that sort of stuff. So that was really big in the 80s. And then what you saw with Bush is he enhanced that by they passed different laws about different sorts of drugs, deciding which were more dangerous and which were less dangerous, and you had harsher or more lenient penalties depending on which drug you were caught with. So, marijuana, not as serious, cocaine, more serious, crack, the most serious, of those levels of drugs. And your sentences were harsher depending on what level or scale of drug that you were caught with or you were selling. And one of the things, the common concern complaint that you'll see in the Bush administration is that they really gave different sentences to people who used urban drugs versus suburban drugs. So what you noticed in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, was that for whatever reason, wealthier people used cocaine and poorer people and inner city people used crack. So, I mean, it's just, okay, I'm going to be honest with you. I really don't know much about either drug, and this is probably not the time for you to share your knowledge about either drug. But for whatever reason, crack was cheaper, cocaine more expensive. But wealthier people tend to run for office and get elected. And wealthier people also have kids who break laws. So they're passing laws that probably protect their constituents and maybe their children. So these sentences were much harsher for inner city drug use than they were for suburban drug use. That also meant that because inner cities were markedly more poor than suburban areas, than suburbs, that people of color also are overrepresented in cities. They're more poor people of color. So the drug laws are going to disproportionately affect poor people, which disproportionately affects people of color. So you're going to see a really big increase in imprisonment of people who are Black and people who are Hispanic during this era. Then what you'll start to see at the end of the Bush administration into the Clinton administration and beyond is privatization of prisons. And you see that a little more in the South and the Midwest, but you see that in every state, to be honest. So rather than run the prisons, the state will hire a company to run the prison, and then that company begins to lobby people in the legislatures to change laws, because the more people go to prison, the more money they make. So the harsher those laws are, and the more prison sentences that are given out, the more profit somebody makes. And they're going to say that, oh, we're just trying to make the place safer, but there's somebody who's profiting from this as well. And then in the Clinton administration, they add on to this. It's like, I want to be seen as tough on crime as well. And the president-elect Biden also helps to make sure this bill gets passed in the Senate. It's referred to as I think it's just called the Crime Reform Act of whatever year it was, maybe 96. But it's referred to as the 3 strikes and you're out law. And here's what this law does. Once you get your 3rd felony conviction, and they made sure that certain drug convictions were felony convictions, then your 3rd jail sentence is life in prison. So 3 jail felonies, which, if you're on the wrong path, that could happen fairly quickly in your life. If you're on the wrong path and careless, which I assume those things kind of go together, you get arrested 2 or 3 times, have a certain amount of crack versus cocaine, or even cocaine at this point, your 3rd conviction, you're in jail for life. And, also, if you're poor, you're not going to get a good lawyer. And I don't mean to discourage you if you're poor and something bad happens to you. But, and I know, because we all know, if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. There's a difference in the one who's appointed for you and Johnny Cochran, from my era, or the best lawyer you can afford. You get a different result typically. So, if you get the free lawyer and you're poor and the laws are written in a way to kind of ensure that you're going to jail when wealthier people who commit the same crime won't get the same result, it's going to be a problem. So we end up with a record number of people in jail during the Clinton administration for longer sentences. We have privatized prisons. We have more young people in jail. We have an enormous percentage of Black men in jail during this time period. Trying to remember, and I don't think your book says the percentage, but there was a time when I was first teaching high school, so it was in the 90s, when it was more likely that an African American young man, like 18 to 25, was in jail than in college. There's a higher percentage of young African American men in jail than in college. And, you know, when people talked about that statistic, there were two ways that that was interpreted. One, young Black men are out of control, or two, the system is out of control because it unfairly targets young Black men. And I think what we've eventually decided is that the drug laws and the 3 strikes and you're out law were written in a way, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that disproportionately affected young men of color. Fairly, unfairly, intentionally, unintentionally. And I know when I taught high school, which wasn't that long ago, it's been a year and a half, and I taught it for a long time. I taught in several different types of schools, some that, you know, were so poor, pretty much everybody got free lunch. Some where nobody got free lunch, some where I'm the only white person in the room, some where if you could find somebody who wasn't white, it was hard. Some urban, you know, some inner city, some rural poverty, some suburban. And I know when I taught in the suburban schools, they would ask me, especially, I taught in one that wasn't as affluent and then one that was pretty affluent. And those kids in the affluent school, like, where did you teach before? And I told them, they go like, oh my gosh, that must have been dangerous. All those kids must have been on drugs. And I said, look, I think probably the same percentage of those kids were on drugs as are at this school. It's just the type of drugs that you use is different. And your lawyers are different. So they have records and you don't. And I think there's just a lot of truth to that. And this era is where we set up the differences in those laws that but disproportionately affects poor people, which tends to be people of color. So the 3 strikes and you're out law is and I think it's really called the Crime Prevention Act of, I want to say it's 1996, but I'll try to remember to look that up before we have class next time. But the crime laws during this time period are really punitive, really punitive. And what you see what you start to see in the Bush administration, the later Bush administration, then a little more in the Obama administration, and then frankly, quite a bit more in the Trump administration, is pushing back against those laws, pardoning people from that era, and, you know, trying to make some corrections. And, you know, it's probably not one of the things you would associate with the Trump administration, but several of the pardons that Trump has issued, and you saw some from Obama as well, and some from Bush as well, but you've seen it more publicly, I think, in the Trump administration. Of course, that could, you know, there could be reasons for that as well. Are people with minor drug offenses or a series of more serious drug offenses where people have already served 20 years, like, just let them out. So, but there's a lot of pushback against that now. And I think you're going to hear a lot about that because President-elect Biden was one of the main sponsors of that bill. And also because Vice President-elect Kamala Harris put a lot of people in jail in California when she was a young prosecutor, because that was her job. And of course, has certainly come out against that. One of the new pieces of legislation that was filed just today is to reverse some drug laws. So, and it was filed by Kamala Harris. So I'm not suggesting that either of those people think the same way that they used to. I am suggesting that those things are going to come up, and there's going to be a push, particularly for those 2 people, to make changes because of the role that they either played in passing the law or enforcing the law, if any of that makes sense. that was a lot of talking about the drug law, wasn't it? But I think that stuff, as a historian, that stuff is pretty fascinating. As a person who lives in the United States, it's pretty tragic, my opinion. But I also recognize I hardly ever drink and I have never used drugs. So I would not be a person that would think like, no, just do whatever you think. Um, with things changing, the law that was passed today, not passed, excuse me, the law that was filed today by Kamala Harris is to decriminalize marijuana at a national level. I don't know that that's a law that would get passed, but it's interesting that it got filed. And you guys have noticed that, different states have already decriminalized that. And, that's an unusual issue because the state doesn't really have the authority to do that when it's still criminal on the federal level. Because if there's a conflict between the state and federal law, the federal law always wins out. But when states are passing those laws decriminalizing marijuana, what they're saying is we're not going to work very hard we're not going to prosecute this at the state level. That doesn't mean that the DEA couldn't come into Oregon and say, like, I don't care that the city of Portland says you can use all the cocaine you want, it's still illegal and you're going to the federal penitentiary. They still could do that. Now, are they going to do that? Kind of depends. And if they do that, is that more of a political thing, or I don't know, it's tricky stuff. But I mean, they did file a bill today. Kamala Harris is one, because she's still a senator. So she filed a bill today along with some other people, but she's a co-sponsor to make marijuana, to decriminalize marijuana at the federal level. So, and I know that there's arguments for and against that as well. Understood. And I don't know, but I don't know. And I think too, it's interesting when we have these big shifts within parties. Usually there's a pushback against it. I mean, that's part of why the 80s was so conservative, because parts of the 60s and 70s were so liberal. And then I think the beginning of the 90s was conservative, but then, pushing back against, certainly not Clinton as a person, but things that passed during the Clinton administration, we became a little more, I don't know that liberal is the right word, but I think you do see, pushback when we go too far in one direction or the other. So I think we are still pushing back against some of the drug laws and the criminal laws that are passed during the era we're studying, because these guys, they go pretty far. I mean, they do. And when I know it's Texas and we want to deregulate everything and everything private is good and everything government is bad. But when it becomes profitable for you to imprison people, that could potentially be a problem. And there's a pushback against that right now. And, I don't know what the proper balance is. Thankfully, I'm not in charge of that. Some days I'm probably barely competent to teach U.S. history. So I don't know, running the whole show of the United States. All right, let me mention some stuff really quickly, and then we'll probably wrap it up for today because it is almost time. I got excited about the drug laws and again, I'm gonna say, I've never tried an illegal drug, and it's not because I personally think, no, you should. I don't think you should use drugs at all. I'm gonna say that because it's not helpful for you. However, I will also say one of my very best friends had brain cancer, and she used THC, and it was very helpful to her. And I think there are appropriate uses for it. You on a Friday night, it's probably not it, but my friend and her brain tumor, that probably was it. I mean, that probably was. So, but I don't have all the answers at all. Not my job, but probably a good discussion we need to have, in the legislature. So yeah, there you go. Again, I couldn't be, much more conservative personally as far as those things, but I also recognize that putting somebody in jail because they had marijuana and putting them in jail for years. It's probably not the right answer either. All right, some other stuff. My goodness, sorry, I keep scrolling. Clinton administration's strange rise of terrorism, the domestic version, the bombing in Oklahoma City of the IRS federal building, and that was 2 guys from the United States, one of whom gets executed and one who's in jail forever. And they built a bomb out of fertilizer, farming stuff, chemicals. Rise of militia groups, especially in Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, although we're going to have something like a militia group in Waco, in this era. Foreign terrorism as well. They had a bombing at the World Trade Center in the basement during that time period. Those guys got caught and somebody went to jail forever for that. And presidential scandals. And we'll just mention these and maybe start with these next time. The minor scandals, Whitewater, which was a real estate deal the Clintons participated in Arkansas, and everybody loses money except the Clintons. Oops. Travelgate, which is a very minor scandal, where they fired everyone in the White House travel office. Typically, you retained those employees from administration to administration, but they fired everybody and gave those jobs to their friends. Very minor scandal, certainly not illegal, just unusual. And then the impeachment scandal. Part of this, maybe not illegal, or unusual. I am guessing, okay, I know for sure, as do you, that other presidents have had affairs while they were president. There is no doubt that President Clinton had an affair while he was president. We have way more evidence than anybody even wants to know about. However, he is sued for sexual harassment during his presidency for stuff he had done before he was president, when he was attorney general and then governor in Arkansas. And the women who filed the lawsuit, what Clinton asked is not necessarily that it be dismissed, but that it be delayed until his presidency was over. The court that heard that case said, no, we're going to go ahead and proceed with it. So they sent a lawyer to the White House to take a deposition from Clinton, a statement under oath, and they asked him about, had he harassed them, had he had relationships with them, and they had found out that he was currently having an affair, and that the person he was having an affair with kept evidence. We'll just go with that, so that they knew they could prove beyond a doubt that he had had an affair with Monica Lewinsky. So to establish a continuing pattern, they asked him, are you currently having an affair with Monica Lewinsky? And he said no. Since they could prove that wasn't true, he gets impeached for lying under oath for perjury, which he's definitely guilty of. But then, the House says, no, he's guilty of this. So the Senate has the trial, and what the Senate has to decide is this enough to kick him out of the presidency for? And of course should I say of course, but they decided it was not, for a variety of reasons, probably some better than others. Okay, we'll start going over foreign policy. We can revisit scandals next time if you want. Now, before you go, here are people that I never saw today, and if you're here, just remind me. Let me stop the recording.